I have a coaching client at 3. Okay, good. Good. Okay, sounds good. And welcome everybody. Here we are. It's as Debbie was reminding us, it's the long weekend, and I can savor some funny moments of going camping on a long weekend where it was anything from really warm to snowing. So because we are in Canada and that's what we have, every range of weather going. It's quite remarkable. But I will pass uh, the speaking baton over to our wonderful Susan Johnson, who will then introduce our guest speaker for today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming today. This afternoon, we hear from Suzanne Sherkin, who wrote the book, When Gender is in Question, A Guide to Understanding, something that's going to be very helpful in these days. So Suzanne, please take it away.
That was a short, sweet introduction. Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you, Reverend John Joseph. Thank you. It is really a pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting me into your space. I'm thrilled when people invite me to speak because I feel I have such important information to share, information that was hard won by me and information that I recognize is, as Susan mentioned, of interest to a lot of people, and it's a gap of understanding that I recognize a lot of people have. So thank you for inviting me into your space. My plan is to give you an idea of how it came to be that I wrote this book and give you some of the background and some of the stories and some of the insight of the learnings and the takeaways from the book. And then after a time, we'll open it up and answer your questions. So please write your questions in the chat or just save them until I can address them. So I'll begin by saying that I gave birth to 2 daughters. My 2 children are now 35 and 33. So some time ago, I began this journey. My youngest child, who's now 33, was always an interesting challenge. We all, as those who have children, know that not all children are the same. But when I look back, I recognize that my youngest child gave lots and lots of hints about their authentic gender identity, being male, not female. And I did not pick them up. I did not know what I did not know. And it was not until my child was in his early 20s, first year university, I think maybe 20, that he began this journey himself and introduced the family into the journey. And it was when I discovered what it was about and I knew I needed to do the research that I began to write the book. Here's how it all came to me. So my then daughter came to us. So the family at the time was mother, father, older sister. At that time, they came at first year university and identified that they were gay. It was really a non-issue in the family. It was a very, it was a non-issue. It was, that's great. Be well, and we're 100% supporting you. And it was very good news that they seem to be happier on this path of knowing their own sexual orientation. Later on that year, actually at the end of their first year university, they came to me again. They were home, and they one night, and I document this in the book because it was like the one event that changed everything. And they said, Ma, I have some videos to show you. Now we would call them blogs, but they said, I have some videos to show you. And I thought, oh, great. Maybe I'll get the popcorn out. Maybe we're going to have a fun night in our jammies. Right. And so I said, okay, great. And so I went into their room and we kind of sat on the floor, propped up the video, the computer. So this was probably 12 years ago. 12, 13 years ago. Okay, so this is I don't know what year that is even. Maybe somebody can do the math, but it was certainly before Caitlyn Jenner. It was before Chaz Bono. It was before Orange is the New Black. It was, there was no discussion about gender diversity at that time. Certainly not in my community, in my immediate understanding of society, right? And so we propped up this laptop and we began to watch. And initially what I saw on the screen was this one individual who was as close as I am on the screen, and they were speaking about their own questioning of their own gender identity. And it was very bold and very direct about them not being the gender, not identifying with the gender that they were born into. And then there was another one about someone else talking about how they were just thrilled to have gone through top surgery, and they lifted up their shirt to show us these very, very angry scars where their breasts had been, but on their face was this elation of joy, of just such relief. And and it was about the third video that I watched. I finally turned to my child. I said, what are we watching here? And they turned to me and they said, Ma, I think I'm a guy. I think that's what all of this discomfort has been in my life. That's what's happening. And therein began our journey. I wish I could say that I was immediately open and embracing and making it as normalized as I did when they came to me and talked about their sexual orientation. This was less understandable. This was more confusing. I had nowhere to put this information. I remember saying, well, why don't we just start with a breast reduction, and trying to kind of negotiate, because I didn't really understand what this is about. So there was a period of time, and I would say probably about a month or a few weeks, I don't exactly remember, where now Skylar, his chosen name, went to his sister. His sister was always on side, and I soon grew to be on side, and his father soon grew to be on side as well. So I would say that there was sort of a few weeks or a month of like not really understanding what to do with this brand new information, no one to speak to, no groups. We didn't even have the language to talk about it. There was some, I think there must have been some shame. I think I felt, because I didn't know if this was something bad or wrong, if I was at fault in some way as a parent. I had no real context for this. What overrode all of my questioning, however, and all of my inner dialogue of confusion, what overrode that was my sense of unconditional love for my child. And it became unequivocally clear that it was our job to embrace Skylar in whatever way he needed to be embraced, and move forward in a way that he needed us to move forward. And once that clicked in or kicked in, everything became I won't use the word easy, but it became more clear that the path was a path of support, not of questioning, not of shame, not of blame, not of wondering if there was something wrong here. The path was one of normalizing, integrating, and loving. And that became very clear. And once we were all four of us were on that path together, Skylar began to take incremental steps, one at a time, to find his way. He was trying to find his way as well. I'll back up and say that it was only when I began researching so I could understand more that I actually interviewed him for the book. And I did, as I interviewed so many people across the country, so many gender questioning and gender transitioning people across the country of all ages, I interviewed Skylar as well. And only then did I find out so much of the truth, so much of the backstory of what was going on for him prior to that, first night. Ma, can I show you some videos? I had heard from him, and by the way, I finally convinced him to write about this, and he is now a co-author in the book. He talked about how it wasn't until he was in first year university that he actually met his first transgender person. So Skylar had always been, I would say, really uncomfortable in his skin, and it's hard to clarify exactly what that means, but the evidence of that was that he was never comfortable in social situations. He never wanted to be in a family situation. He looked uncomfortable in his body. He was just awkward. He battled, I wouldn't say he battled depression, but he battled confusion, I would say. Depression was a part of that. And so there's a quote in the book that said, if I had known at 5 that about transitioning, my life would have been so much happier. So he talked about that, and he talked about when he first met that individual and he realized this was an option. It suddenly threw his life, so he's 20 now, it suddenly threw his life into questioning. And he talks about how he couldn't be out in public because he didn't know who he was. He didn't know how he should be. He was really battling with himself. And so I learned a little bit about that backstory as well. And so when he did finally get the courage and the words to address it within himself, and then identify that he did not identify with the gender that he was born into as a female. He identified with a male gender. When he finally got the language and understood that, and he came to us, and then we began the journey. He then began his transition, and what that meant for him initially was to go with his sister Lauren, his older sister Lauren, to find a doctor. There are only a few people in the medical profession who actually specialize in, it used to be called a sex change. It's not called a sex change anymore. It's called gender affirming surgery. It went from sex change to sex affirming surgery, and now it's gender affirming surgery. So gender affirming surgery is a very specialized form of medicine. And there are a few doctors who do that. And they found one close by in Toronto. And so just to insert a little bit about the medical end of it. So gender affirming surgery involves the possibility of many surgeries, but primarily it's either top surgery or bottom surgery. Top surgery is from the waist up, bottom surgery is from the waist down. So he as from female to male, and that's so in gender, in transitioning from one gender to another, from one binary to another binary, the term is male to female, MTF, or female to male, FTM. So as a female wanting to transition to male, one of the first things that he wanted to do is to present himself in a way that he felt more akin to. And that meant not having breasts, which is why initially I said, well, why don't we just have a breast reduction? And so, right. But it wasn't about a breast reduction. It was just shifting his whole physique so that he would present, or to use more of an appropriate word, to express himself. He wanted to express himself in the world as a male. So he and Lauren went off and found a doctor to, and it was probably, it was a year and a half, I would say, before he was actually ready to go through with that surgery, which he did. Before then, there were many steps. One of the first things he did when he came out to family and beginning to come out to friends, first he had to come out to himself, and then to family, and then to friends. One of the first actions he initiated, was to cut his hair. He had this, his hair was this force of nature. It was huge, and it was in dreads, these very, very long dreads. And we ended up cutting his hair. He had these long dreads, and we had this beautiful ritual of planting it under an apple tree. And we had, friends and family, and it was like this kind of beautiful ritual of transition. And so we planted his dreads, and he changed his name to Skylar. And we and he moved in gradually, bit by bit, into his male expression. Because he wasn't yet ready to move into top surgery, he did what many female to male gender questioning people do, is he bound his breasts. It's a really painful thing, and what that entails is getting a very thick piece of rubber that's designed specifically for this purpose, and putting it around his breasts to flatten them, and so that he can appear as breastless as possible. And what he revealed is that, yes, it made him look less female, but it took his breath away, literally, because it pressed so deeply into his chest. There's lots of other stories that he revealed to me in the interview I had with him, which is to say that when public bathrooms became an issue, and he went into a female bathroom because he hadn't yet come out as fully as male. And because he was sort of in this mid phase of transitioning, he was yelled at and really and accosted practically by a woman in the bathroom, who proclaimed that he had no right to be there. He was a predator, and she called the security and had him thrown out of the female bathroom. It was awful. A couple of months later, he went into a male public bathroom, and soon after being there, he was followed out by two guys who said that he wasn't male looking enough, and beat him up and left him on the roadside. So those were kind of some of the treacherous mid-transitional pieces. I, of course, the mama is not really told any of this. It's only after the fact. But he carried on, of course, and as he progressed through his transition and expressing more as a male, he became more clear about how he wanted to be. Now, 10, 11 years later, I'm just so happy to say that he's this very handsome young man. He takes testosterone, also called T-shots, every week, I think, or every month. I'm not sure. It's sort of like a diabetic will always be on T-shots. And and he's got a little beard, and he's a very healthy guy. He's a healthcare worker. So he sees clients and provides support for them. So that's kind of his journey. And backing up, why I decided to write this book was because I had no context. I had no knowledge for how to think about that. I am what I now know is to be a cisgender woman, cis, CIS. And what I now know is that as a cis person, I am someone who is very comfortable in the gender that has been identified at birth. You hear that phrase a lot, the gender identified at birth means that when you are born and the doctor or whomever pulls you out of your mama's belly, based on the genitals that you have, which, by the way, is not the only way to identify gender, but generally by the genitals, you are identified as either male or female, and that's put on your birth certificate, the gender identified at birth. For those of us, and I say us because us being those cisgender people who identify with their gender identified at birth, it's never dawned on us. We know we're cisgender because it's never dawned on us to ask the question, am I comfortable in this gender? If you've never asked that question, you're cisgender. Cis is a Latin prefix, actually, that means this side of. And the opposite of cis is trans. So that's where we get the words. And trans means the other side of it. We've all heard words that begin with trans, transition, transportation, transatlantic. So many words in the English language begin with trans across the way. So I wanted to understand what that journey was about. There wasn't anything for me to read, really. I mean, there were lots of books out there. This was about 5 years ago when I began researching. There were books out there, but they were primarily written by trans people, and there wasn't anyone with my voice. So I began to research because I wanted people to really understand this. And primarily, I wanted cisgender people to understand this because although we don't have a statistic of how many trans people there are in the world, what we do know is that cisgender people are in the significant majority. And the reason we don't know the statistic of trans people is because how do you get statistics? In this case, you might, if you go online, you might see that 1% of the population, that's what I found. It was identified that 1% of the population was trans. Well, where did they get that 1%? So that 1% was identified by the number of people who actually presented themselves to a medical facility to ask for support, to self-identify, and or to ask for medical support. In the end, and as you can imagine, that's only a percentage of the people who are actually gender questioning or gender diverse in some way. So many people do not step into a medical facility and get help. So many don't want to have any surgeries. Many don't identify publicly at all. And so it is not clear what the percentage is, but what we do know is that cisgender is the significant majority. And so this book is for cis people to understand, people who are parents, who are grandparents, who are siblings, who are friends, who are allies, colleagues, managers, curious people, neighbors, right? Who have recognized that gender diversity is now a part of the lexicon of our daily discourse, and they may not understand it, particularly if you have not had any personal involvement with someone who is trans. That may not have occurred to you to find out information. And I feel very committed to communicating this information so that people will have less discrimination and have greater sense of normalizing it. And that's really the essence of why I wrote the book, so that people will have information. The more information they have, the more normalized gender diversity is and will be. And the more normalized it will be, the less harassment, discrimination, and embracing it will be in social circles, in families, particularly in families. And so to that end, I have, following the writing of the book, I conduct monthly dialogues. I now have a Facebook group. I have a YouTube channel. I have a podcast. I have lots of ways to increase awareness for people to get involved in discussion, to get their questions asked, to find safe spaces, whether you're someone who's gender questioning or you're someone who's gender curious. So that is the essence of my story of how I came to writing When Gender is in Question, A Guide to Understanding. And I'm very happy to answer your questions.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. Now I'm sure people have a few questions. Do people have they have to think on that? And do you want to just put your hand up or weigh in? Or
I don't know if you can answer this. I'm curious about, I know on Facebook several people who are gender fluid, in trans, anyway, dead name, is it that they simply didn't exist before, or is it just that that name, is it like when you change your name after getting married, they go all the way back and change your birth certificate? Is it that idea that I've always been this?
It's a really good question, Susan. The term dead name is a bit contentious. So what it means is that the name previous to your transition is your dead name, the name you no longer want to have used. And the name of your chosen name post-transition is your current name.
Okay.
So there are different philosophies around that. Some, I have spoken with many parents, and some parents say, absolutely, I am never using the birth name that we gave our child. That's never being used. And other parents say, you know, when I talk about them as a baby, pre-transition, sometimes I'll slip in that name, and that's okay. My feeling about it is that the person who transitions and chooses their own name should be addressed by their name, their current name, their chosen name, and their chosen pronoun as well. We haven't spoken about pronouns, but that's also comes with the pronouns. And so when I speak about Skylar, even though Skylar transitioned at about 2021, and I speak about Skylar prior to 2021, I will still call him he and still say Skylar. But I can say that it's taken a little while in the family, and probably for the first few years, we talked about his female name while we all kind of got used to it. But now it's just Skylar and he pronoun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions from people?
Yeah, I have a question. Suzanne.
Peter. Peter. Okay. What I'll do is I'll take 1 second. I'll take the spotlight off so we can see Peter's face, and that way, great gallery. Great. Okay. Good.
Okay. Thank you very much, Suzanne, first of all, for having had the courage to write this book and all the research that you've done, and to embrace all that your son had to disclose to you. And I'm just curious about what your immediate reaction was when you learned of this development.
Yeah, I see that, and I saw that you put that up in the chat, and actually when you put that up, I was kind of thinking about that. My immediate reaction, to be honest, was complete unknowing. I won't say confusion. It was just an unknowing because it was a new thought, and most of us don't. There are rare occasions when we come across something so new that we have no context for it, and when we do, it gives us pause to stop and say, like, what is this about? And I think, and that's what went on for me. I was just, I think, in a bit of shock. I didn't know how to think about it. I had no context for it, and so I did feel in a state of confusion. I guess I can say that because I didn't know what to think with all this flurry of thinking and no one to speak to about it. And so there was this thought, this sense of not understanding, not having any context for this information, along with this onslaught of blame and shame and not knowing what was right and what voice to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said a few minutes ago, that all of that finally quieted down when I recognized that this is not about me. This is about unconditional love here. Mm-hmm. And so all of that confusion quieted down, and I just got into love and openness and let Skylar lead the way.
I personally came out to my parents when I was 16 years old that I was gay, and I got the silent treatment for 2 years.
Oh.
Not because they didn't love me, because they didn't understand.
Yes.
I had to deal with that in different ways. I can tell you that it was excruciatingly painful, both from a psychological perspective as well as emotional, especially emotional. I can't tell you how many times I passed my mother in the hallway of our house, begging to myself to tell her. I just couldn't find the courage. I just could not. And I needed another person to assist me. And I don't know how it happened, but my brother-in-law decided to assist me. So I decided to tell him, who in turn told the rest of the family. So it made it a bit more palatable for me. It took that a huge amount of fear. And I thought when I came out to my parents, it was over and done with. It is not. It is a lifelong torture. if you don't deal and learn to manage both the fear, the shame, the resentments, all of those. And I did not know that all of that had a spiritual connection for me. It was all very interesting. I've only started recently to share in public about my orientation. And it was with, I'm in a 12-step program. It was with the help of my sponsor. I could still not do it alone. I needed help. I just wanted to share that with the group, that it is not easy. I really applaud you for having, embraced your child just as they are, and to actually gone quite a few steps further to investigate and to educate yourself. And now you're educating others. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's lovely. And thank you for telling us of your journey too. There is lots of treachery in journeys that are not normalized or not seen as being normalized. And it takes huge courage, right? And there is a community of those, a natural community of those who understand that kind of courage.
Yeah. The biggest fear is the fear of acceptance.
Mm.
Biggest fear.
Thank you for
Thank you.
sharing
How do
that.
you feel about, I've seen on TV a couple of episodes where parents make the decision for their younger children. Like they seem to recognize that their daughter should be a boy. Like, have you ever focused on that area of work?
So that's
Now we're getting into children and it's a little difficult. And then of course, there was another episode that I saw on CBC where babies are born, but they don't have a gender. They get to choose. And it's like, that's a little mind-boggling. I mean, I can understand as somebody gets older, like more mature, they can decide, that, or they may have the feelings of being another sex or another gender. But do you think it's right for parents to pursue this with a 4 or a 5-year-old?
So thank you for your questions, Debbie. So there's two things that you've identified and I want to address them. So to the second point about babies not being born without a gender. So actually the term for that is intersex. It used to be called hermaphrodite, but we don't use that term anymore. It's now called intersex. And intersex people, there are statistics around that because those are identified in the medical, at birth. So apparently the statistic is about 3%, about the same percentage as redheads, essentially. So there's about 3% of people who are born intersex, and that means that they don't have, their genitalia is not clearly binary, not clearly male or clearly female. Some are born with both genitals. And in fact, there is this is just sometimes tricks of human birth that goes back to biblical times. It's also very common in the natural world, in other mammals. It just happens because chromosomes sometimes get duplicated in ways that are that come out that reveal themselves in genital disproportionate identity. And so in that case, there are options. Parents who I would say who are elevated in their thinking will allow their child to choose their gender. parents in the early days when it was a shameful thing, and so parents would just assign a gender, and that didn't always work out for the child. So in those cases, it's best, and it's not just best, but it's highly advisable for the parent to allow the child to choose. There is unequivocal research that shows that a child knows internally from the time they're 3 or 4, they know if they are their birth assigned gender or not. They know that. And as I said in my early remarks too, I now can follow the path, the breadcrumbs from Skylar, that I didn't know that he was leaving breadcrumbs. And to be honest, to be fair, he didn't know he was leaving breadcrumbs either, because he didn't even have that. But I can look back and I can see where he was giving us clear messages that he was more of a boy than a girl. So to your second question about, should parents choose or support the gender, they, there are some really difficult stories to read in the research about how one particular doctor ended up choosing genders of a child, and convincing parents to do so, and there were lots of unfortunate outcomes in that. So I would say that the more we can allow a child to find their own expression, even if we see it as a phase, a quote phase that they're going through, allow them to express. The truth of it is, all of us are on the gender spectrum somewhere. All of us embody male and female characteristics and identities, and somewhere in between. All of us do. It's simply the construct of our social fabrics that have required us to be clearly male or clearly female, but that's actually not essential human nature. That's going to be my next book, but for now, that's the answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions from people? So what? Go ahead, Mike.
I was just curious, is the gender affirming surgery covered by the healthcare system?
That is a great question. So I need to answer that question in 2 ways. One is to say that if a person who wants gender affirming surgery goes through a medical process through health medical process, then it is covered. Yes, it is covered. But if they don't go through medical process and they just go to the doctor and find a doctor and do it on their own, then it's not covered. So I'll tell you how that, why that is and what that's about. There's something called a DSM, which is the diagnostic DSM. It's the diagnostic. It's the Bible, the medical Bible for what medical conditions are being covered by insurance. And up until this couple of years ago, it was always identified in the DSM for doctors throughout North America and maybe in Europe too, that someone who questions their gender was identified to have a mental illness. And now they've changed that, thankfully, so that it's called gender dysphoria. And so it's still considered to be a medical condition, gender dysphoria, which means that you experience some anxieties around recognizing that you don't associate or feel comfortable with your gender assigned at birth, right? So it's the discomfort rather than an illness, right? And so if you identify with a doctor and are given a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, then that surgery can be covered.
Okay.
That takes a number of years. If, however, you want to bypass all that and just go and get your surgery, as Skylar did, he raised the $7,000 himself and he just went to get the surgery on his own. And a lot of people choose that because it's quicker. They don't have to go through the whole medical profession and, requirements, etc.
Thank you.
That was a long answer to a short question.
That's great. And just into other questions from people. So I'll share with you a brief anecdote of what happened a couple of years back. My father passed. There was a minister who conducted the funeral, and then there was an email reach out from the Orangeville area. Can I help this person? And the person said, well, you may not remember me. I buried your father. But when I buried your father, I was Edward, now I'm Christina. Ta-da. And Christina did something that was, bigger than parents. Christina went away and was a minister at Trinity United in Shelburne, came back reassigned, and did ta-da to the congregation. You can well imagine in Trinity and Shelburne, some people thought, oh yes, wonderful support. And then some people did the whole, well, what'll the children do? And they needed someone like you living in Shelburne, because quite honestly, some of their reaction was not very positive. Needless to say, Christina moved out of Shelburne, but is in very successful ministry now. But it just, to your point, how people find out and how people tell people, there's, probably a difference between a person in their 20s speaking versus someone who was in their 40s or 50s. It's a different journey. But I still think there's that sense of coming out of the proverbial gender closet, whatever that means, right? Yeah, I think it's, as you said, it's a journey. I think you said, Peter Garinelli, yeah, you're always coming out. And I think I've heard that story many times before, and I think it's very, very, very powerful. And I think it's there's 1,000 questions we'd love to ask you, but I know you said you leave by 1:55, which is rapidly coming up to us. Yeah.
Oh, 2:55.
Okay, sorry, I read that's good. I read that wrong. Good. Okay, good.
Yeah.
We have more time than I thought. Wonderful, phenomenal. Now, as I'm sure other people have other questions. Now you said you left some books at the church. Now, how many did you leave?
I left 2. I'm
Okay,
happy to leave more if you require them.
So what we can do, I'll do first come, first dibs. Who wants to borrow one? And just send me a message, and we'll put your name on it. We can create a roster at that point in time. Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah. And I heard a yeah. Who was that? Yes.
I would like to learn about what other media you use. You named a few.
Yes, and so I would. So actually, the best thing is to do. I'm going to put my name in or my email address.
In the chat. Yeah.
So my email address is gender in question at gmail.com. And so you can send me a note and I can add your email to the newsletters I send out, which are probably a couple times a month. I have a monthly dialogue where I just had one last night. I had people on who talked about how they came up to family. I've had a dialogue with parents and grandparents, and I will be having another dialogue about workplace. So I have monthly dialogues, and I have a YouTube channel that has all of the dialogues and all the interviews I do. And I've just created a Facebook page as well for a
I
safe.
hope that some of the
space.
school boards are paying attention to you so that many people in those schools don't have to go through the same agony I did.
Yes.
Yes. Well, you know what? To that point, I'm really glad you mentioned that because my goal, one of the ways that I'm focusing my time around this marketing, getting it out there, is to contact schools. And so, if any of you have contacts in schools, whether it's independent or private or board schools, I would so love a contact so that I can help get my book into curriculum, into school libraries, so that I can be presenting to teachers and students. That's really my goal. So any help from you all would be so welcome.
Are you looking for a contact with the TDSB as a whole, or are you thinking individual schools like the schools that our kids go to?
Oh, well, either and both. Anywhere, anyone who would listen to me, basically. So I know that the TDSB is this
It is.
very large place of that's tough to break into. But so I need individual names. So whether these are individual names of teachers who would be interested even in bringing me into their classroom or buying a couple books for their kids, or principals or superintendents, any level. I'm
Guidance counselors as well, guidance counselors.
absolutely guidance counselors. Yes.
I have a couple of I have kids in the system, one in grade 9 and one in grade 11. So I will certainly look into. They both have English. No, one of them has English, and the other one has social science. And I feel like it's very relevant because it seems like when I sit with them or when I overhear what they're doing in class, they're the shift in high school is absolutely incredible in that most of what they talk about is justice based. It's either about people of color, gender issues, it'll be about like the environment, sustainability. I mean, honest to God, if our kids don't graduate like super angry, I will be amazed. Because
Well,
it's all they're talking about. And that's a good, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I just feel like there's so much activism brewing at that level, and I will be amazed if it doesn't bubble up into action.
so I love what you're saying, and I hear that as well. I mean, my kids are, 33 and 35, so they're long gone in the school system. But what I hear from so many friends and colleagues and people I speak to is that young people in the school system actually have a very different attitude. They
Yeah.
are really into activism, and they are really into normalizing
Mm.
so many things that we couldn't uh, figure out how to normalize. So, just the parents yesterday were talking about how what they were both talking to their young kids, and it was just not an issue. Like kids seem to have a much more accepting, laissez-faire sensibility about difference than my generation.
And I wonder, if some of that discomfort is learned as a like maybe we don't have the discomfort inherently. Maybe it is somehow taught, somehow comes through whatever vehicle structure, and so yeah, so it's a good thing, right? The kids are so like what? That's just the way that is.
Totally. That's exact. Well, right. You're trans. Okay. Pass
Yeah,
the salt.
absolutely not a big deal to them. So
Yeah.
So as we're talking about that, one of the things that does come to mind is two things. One, I remember it's related to this. When people were volunteering for the AIDS run in Toronto, I noticed a shift had happened, and a lot of Muslim students were also volunteering. Back to that, there are a lot of cultures that aren't there yet, but sometimes the children might be there because they're learning about it in school.
Right.
So in your dialogues, I can think of extreme Muslim, extreme, well, sometimes Jewish, or any extreme of any religion or whatever. Uh, Is that coming up in your dialogues, Suzanne?
Well, I would say that the dialogues are right now, it's in early stages. I haven't ventured into religious group discussion so far. I will be, and thanks to you, John Joseph, I'm really looking forward to connecting with lots of different religious groups. Um, um, I recognize that religious groups are, um, traditionally have been less open to non-conventional behavior. And so I'm really looking forward to breaking into religious groups. It has not been a discussion up until now, likely because I've not avoided it, but maybe sidestepped it in favor of a more public, more generalized presentation, I would say.
Well, as we're talking, it also reminds, beyond religion, there's also culture. There's some cultures that this isn't even on their radar, like some Asian cultures. So I think it's going to be a huge challenge per se to enter into that dialogue, and because it's not as if it goes away. I mean, it's here, and so it's a matter of a old expression. Well, you let the horses out of the barn door; they can't go back in, and so to speak. And so it's a matter then of and the good thing is they are talking about it at TDSB,
Right.
and I think that's the great forum of opening. I remember years ago doing a tour when I was at Metropolitan United. There was this world religion class, and there was every culture there. And I was amazed how open they were talking about gay marriage. And I was like, wow, this is a whole different. I would never have talked about this in high school. And how they're more open than we were growing up, but there's still, this is another whole question. And recently we had a service we call it Pi Day, Public Intentional Explicit, and one of our 12-year-olds did a poem that was sort of blew me out of the water. I mean, quite honestly, because the poem was very much about he male, she male, you name it. I mean, there was every phrase and possibility coming forward. And it just, I wouldn't have even known what that was. That was not in my lexicon of anything. I mean, the word gay or whatever was a word of disdain. I mean, really, quite honestly. And so I think we're much further along than we were, definitely. But it goes back to, because we're talking about transgender, but we haven't really touched on non-binary, which is obviously on the table too. And do you address that in your?
Yes,
Okay,
absolutely. And so
okay.
to that point, I'm happy to speak a few minutes about that,
Sure. I
because
think
up
we'd
to
love to hear
now,
that.
I only have spoken about binary, male and female, and the transition, and so the male to female or female to male is very binary. But there is, within those binary goalposts, a spectrum of gender identity, and it's really a spectrum. And there are lots of words to identify that spectrum, that recognize that some people do not feel binary male or binary female all the time, but they feel gender fluid. Gender fluid is a really common term that identifies this kind of motion of moving from one gender to another and feeling absolutely comfortable with expressing according to how they feel. And it really harkens back to the essence of what this conversation is, which is that gender is not about our genitals. Gender is about what's in our head. Gender is in our head, not between our legs. And that's really the one of the key takeaways in understanding this conversation about gender. It's about how we feel about ourselves, and giving everyone the permission and the right and the flexibility to identify in any way that feels comfortable for them, which may or may not fit into the social construct of binary. And I just want to say one other thing, which is that binary identity, male or female, is the most comfortable for everyone. Everyone wants to know if you fit into a male category We're a female category. People want to know, and people get very fussed and uncomfortable and sometimes inappropriate, sometimes aggressive when they feel uncomfortable, which is why Skylar was beat up, was called out in the female bathroom because he didn't look female enough, and why he was beat up from the male bathroom because he didn't look male enough, right? And that's why this conversation is being had all over the world in ways that are challenging, because people get very uncomfortable if they're not, if they don't, if people don't fit into those binary categories. And so where this information I feel is so valuable that I'm discussing is to give people a broader sense of comfort, and by giving them more information and insight into this recognition that all of us at our core have male and female. And if we allow each other to express that, how much happier will we all be? It's not a threat. It's actually an expression of authenticity.
Other questions of people?
Yeah, would you like to, mine's not working. I found your Facebook page. Would you like me to share that and get the word out?
Oh my goodness, Susan, I would just love that. Yes, thank you so much.
Because I've got, as I say, so many friends on Facebook who are struggling with things like this. And
that's so great. The Facebook page just went up, so that's great. You can also share my website.
will do.
Yes, that's great. And I want to say one thing also about language, and I just want to address the word queer, because most of us grew up with the word queer as a really derogatory term. And those of us who didn't feel comfortable, or, if we were, whether it was gender identity or sexual orientation, did not fit into the conventional, we did not want to be labeled as queer, because it was a mean, nasty word. But now that word is actually a prideful word. To be part of the queer community means that you have had courage to step into your non-conventional identities or orientations. And I really love that. And so our language is really changing. And I think it's really important to keep up with how the language is living, in the same way that the pronouns have changed. So as we are recognizing that gender has a non-binary, fluid spectrum to it, so pronouns are being identified to recognize that. We have the he, him, she, her, and that middle piece is the they, them. So when there is someone whose identity you're not sure of, they, them, just as I use they, them to talk about Skylar in his former years, I didn't want to say she or he, so I use they, and that's just fine. So the takeaway with the pronouns is if you're not sure of someone's pronouns, use they, them, or their first name, and that way you're not misgendering them.
I think Gary had a question. Gary?
Yeah, it's a comment rather than a question. I'm being shunned by in-laws, and it's annoying to think that they've got this attitude because I'm in a relationship with Peter. They won't discuss it, nothing. I've just been eliminated. And we can't go into the ethnic community and blame them for their bias when we've got it right within our own families. Yeah. It's a tragic situation. And unfortunately, the particular people in this family claim to be devout Christians, which appalls me to no end. However, if that's the way they want to be, I can't change that. I'm quite happy in my relationship, and the majority of my family and friends are very accepting.
Yeah, Gary, I hear that, and my heart aches to hear that, and I can hear the challenge that you deal with on a daily basis. And the only thing I can say to you, which is obviously what you're doing, is to focus on those who willingly embrace and accept you for who you are, and not be impacted by those who are not, because it's your journey to be who you are authentically.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
It is a journey.
Yes, it is. And finding community and allies and people we can feel safe and comfortable with is really needs to be the core of our journey.
Well, I thought at this point in my life, I'll be 80 in July. I thought, really, have things really changed, or are they still the same? However, I'm happy and I'm here.
Well, congrats. Well, happy birthday. It's wonderful.
Thank you. I just hope I have enough wind to blow out all those candles.
You can get a blow dryer.
Yeah, cheating.
Years ago, there was an episode of Next Generation, I believe it was, or Voyager, where they came across a planet where you weren't allowed to name your gender. And then when there was a couple who got together, and it was verboten to do that, which is rather, so it took it the other way, right? And so you almost said to yourself, okay, so if we get to the point where it's the other direction, should we then maybe keep that open-mindedness to be either or, as opposed to just suddenly society everybody's non-binary? But I mean, in history of the world, we can end up in different pathways, definitely, yeah. So as your dialogue,
Generation had a lot of species that were genderless.
yes. Well, and there's some that can change their gender depending on the need, right? And so keep it something to ask the question of, so as in your dialogue, are they once a month? Susan?
Sorry.
Are your dialogues once a month or weekly?
Yes, I do have my dialogues. In my dialogues, I have a group of people to address different aspects of this. As I mentioned, just yesterday, I had some people who were talking about how they came out to family. Before then, I had people who who had parents, who were parents or grandparents, and talked about how they addressed it with their young children. And I've interviewed Dr. Helma, who is an author, and I interviewed Skylar, who is an author. Moving forward, I do a lot of work in workplaces. So what I do when I'm not writing books, I'm a mediator and a trainer, and I have gone into workplaces across the country to work with leadership who are integrating a trans person. And so I come into that workplace and I help develop their health and safety policies, and we'll do some training with the staff and help the trans person integrate as effectively as possible. And that's a huge deal, because it wasn't very long ago that someone who wanted to transition would have to quit their job, leave the city, or live inauthentically. And now a person can transition at work and be supported and be embraced and acknowledged and feel safe. And it's beautiful. And so I do that kind of work. I'm very interested also in how trans people have had the brilliant insight of being on both sides of that gender divide. So a male to female has insights about what it was like to have some privilege in a workplace as a male, and now they're a female, and what is that? Alternately, female to male, now they have new privilege, and what is that like? And so that's I have a chapter of my book that addresses workplaces and all of that. And I tend to in the coming year I will be doing some dialogues around that. And I will also be doing some dialogues around another topic that's become very interesting and quite current, and it's around trans female to male still maintaining their ability to bear children. And so how does that work within a relationship, within their families, within their communities, within their bodies? So I'm going to be talking about that. There is now the medical profession, I know, is sort of grappling with how that actually operate, how that can be supported. So that's a really interesting area as well.
Well, thank you. Now, do people have any other questions? No. Okay. Well, Suzanne, it's been an honor to have you be part of us. We'll look forward to reading your book and then keeping in. What we'll probably try to do is keep people posted about when the dialogue sessions are. I think that's very important. And very enough. Now, Susan Johnson, can you do your wonderful thank yous and let us know what's next? And
Yes, thank you all very much for coming. Please help spread the word. More we know about anything, less scary it becomes. And this is why the reaction we get is people are afraid. And when they find out there's nothing to be afraid of, then it works. So May 28th, we have Helen Fish, who is talking about grandmothers partnering with Africa, which sounds very, very intriguing. Thank you all for coming.
thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, everyone. And do take advantage of being outdoors. It's the Victoria Day weekend, the traditional time of planting. And for some people, well, I guess we'll be going cottage. I'm not sure if people are camping, but what you could do is take a candle and put it outside and maybe roast a marshmallow on your can. I'm a big fan. Okay. Okay.
Camp out on your balconies.
That's another very good idea. Also, I'm just going to stop recording and then
Weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.